So, one can see for oneself very clearly that fear arises through the structure of thought. Thought, thinking about what happened yesterday, of which one is afraid, thinking about it, or thinking about the future, causes fear. Right? Thought breeds fear. No? Please, sirs, be quite sure. Don't accept what we're talking about, what the speaker is saying. Be absolutely sure for yourself that thought is the origin of fear. Thinking about the pain, psychological pain one has had some time ago and not wanting to repeat it again or have that thing recalled or happen, and thought, thinking about all this breeds fear. Right? Can you go on from there? No, because unless we see this very clearly, you won't be able to follow. Please don't ask questions here. It's quite complex, this, so please, for the moment, just hold on to your question. No, don't hold on to your question. Drop your question, go on with it, what we're talking about. Thought, thinking about an incident, an experience, a state in which there has been a disturbance, danger, grief, pain, brings about fear. Thought, having established a certain security, psychologically, and not wanting that security to be disturbed, any disturbance is a resistance, and therefore fear. So thought is responsible for fear. As thought is responsible for pleasure. Right? One has had a happy experience. Thought thinks about it and wants it repeated, perpetuated. And when that is not possible, there is a resistance. There's anger, despair, and fear. So thought is both responsible for fear as well as pleasure. Right? This is not a verbal conclusion. This is not a formula for avoiding fear. That is, where there is fear, there is pain and pleasure. Pleasure goes with pain. The two are indivisible. And thought is responsible for both. Right? If there was no tomorrow or the next moment to think about either fear or pleasure, then neither exist. Right, sirs? Shall we go on from there? Not, please bear in mind, not as an idea, but an actuality, the thing that you yourself have discovered and therefore real. So you say, by Jove, I have found out for yourself that thought breeds both these things. You have had sexual enjoyment, pleasure. Then you think about it. The image, the pictures, the whole business of it. And the very thinking about it gives strength to that pleasure which you have had. And when that is thwarted, there is pain, anxiety, fear, jealousy, annoyance, anger, brutality. So thought is the origin of both. And we're not saying that you must not have pleasure. Bliss is not pleasure. Ecstasy is not brought about by thought. It's an entirely different thing. And you can only come upon that when you understand the nature of thought, which breeds both pleasure and fear. And when a mind seeks bliss or ecstasy, and there is such a thing which is not pleasure, and to understand that there must be real inquiry and understanding of fear and pleasure which is brought about by thought. So, then the question arises, can one stop thought? You're following all this? If thought breeds fear and pleasure, and where there is pleasure there must be pain, which is fairly obvious, then one asks oneself, can thought come to an end? Which doesn't mean the ending of perception of beauty, the enjoyment of beauty. It's like seeing the beauty of a cloud or a tree and enjoy it totally, completely, fully. But when thought says, I must have that same experience tomorrow, that same delight which I had yesterday when I saw that cloud, that tree, that flower, that face of that beautiful person, then it invites both disappointment, pain, fear, and pleasure tomorrow. Obvious, isn't it? So can thought come to an end? Or is that a wrong question altogether? It's a wrong question because we want to experience an ecstasy of bliss which is not pleasure. Therefore, we hope by ending thought we'll come upon something which is immense, which is not the product of pleasure and fear. So then our question then is, what place has thought in life? Right? Not how to end thought. What is the relationship of thought in action and in inaction? Right? What is the relationship of thought where action is necessary, and why does thought come into existence at all when there is complete enjoyment of beauty, so that it doesn't carry it over tomorrow? I want to find out where thought is necessary, and it is necessary in action. And I also see that where there is complete enjoyment of beauty of a mountain, of a beautiful face, or a sheet of water, Why should thought come there and give a twist to it and say, I must have that pleasure again tomorrow? So I have to find out what is the relationship of thought in action, and thought must not interfere, which is when there is no action of thought at all. Am I making myself clear? Look, I see a beautiful tree without a single leaf against the sky. It's extraordinarily beautiful. And that's enough, finished. Why should thought come in and say, well, I must have that same delight tomorrow? Now you also see that thought must operate in action. Skill in action is also skill in thought, which is really yoga, not merely physical exercise. Yoga also means skill in action, which we won't go into for the moment. So, what is the actual relationship between thought and action? Our action is now based on a concept, an idea. I have an idea or knowledge of what should be done. And what should be done is in approximation to the concept, to the idea, to the ideal. Right? So there is a division between action and the concept, the ideal. This should be. In this division, there is conflict. Right? Any division, psychological division, must breed conflict. And I'm asking myself, what is the relationship of thought in action? If action is separated from the idea, then action is incomplete, right? Because in that there is a separation, division, conflict. Therefore action is incomplete. So, is there an action of thought which sees something instantly and acts immediately, right? And therefore no division, no conflict. And therefore there is not an idea, an ideology, and something to be acted on separate. Right? Is there an action which is the very seeing is the acting, and therefore the very thinking is the action? Right? I see there is the perception that thought breeds fear and pleasure. And where there is pleasure, there must be pain, and therefore resistance to pain. I see that very clearly. The seeing of it is the immediate action. And the seeing of it requires perceptions, thought, logic, thinking very clearly, all that is involved. And the seeing of it is instantaneous, and therefore the action is instantaneous, therefore freedom from it. That means you're a free human being, a different human being, totally transformed. Not tomorrow, but now. Because you see very clearly that thought breeds both fear and pain and pleasure. And all our values are based on that. Moral, ethical, social, religious, spiritual, all the values are based on that. And if you see the truth of it, and to see the truth of it, you have to be astonishingly aware, logically, healthily, sanely observe every movement of thought. Then that very perception is total action. Therefore, when you leave, you're completely out of it. Otherwise, you will say, how am I to be free of fear tomorrow? So, thought must operate in action. And it does operate. To go to your house, you must think. Catch the bus, train, and all the rest of it, or go to the office. More efficiently, more objectively, not personally, not emotionally, the more vital the thought is. But when thought carries on that experience that you have had as a delight, carries on through memory into the future, then such action is incomplete. Therefore, it is a form of resistance, and so on. Right? So then we can go on to the next question. Thought, let's put it that way. What is the origin of thought? And what is the thinker? One can say thought is the response of memory, which is fairly simple to understand. Accumulated memory, knowledge, experience, the background from which there is a response to any challenge. Where you live, if you're asked, there is instant response, and so on. So memory, experience, knowledge is the background of thought. But thought, which is always old, can never be free. You may express itself freely, but it is always old. And therefore, thought can never say anything new. So when I understand that very clearly, then the mind becomes quiet. Right? Because life is a movement. Is a constant movement in relationship. And thought trying to capture that movement in terms of the past is afraid of life. Right? And so, then the question is, seeing all this, seeing freedom is necessary to examine, and to examine very clearly there must be the discipline of learning and not of suppression, imitation. Seeing how the mind is conditioned by society, by the past, and the mind, the brain is the past. And all thought springing from that is old. And therefore it cannot possibly understand anything new. And to understand the mind must be completely quiet. Not controlled, not shaped to be quiet. Now, seeing all that, actually seeing it, not theoretically, then there is an action from that perception, or that very perception is the action of liberation from fear. Right? So when next occasion the fear, any fear arises, there is immediate perception of it and the ending of it. Are we going along together? See, from this arises, perhaps we have no time to go into it this morning. What is love? For most of us, it's fear, pleasure, which we call love. And when there is no fear and the understanding of pleasure, then what is love? And who is going to answer this question? The speaker, the priest, the book? Some outside agency to tell us you're doing marvelously well and carry on? Or having examined, observed, seen non-analytically this whole structure and nature of pleasure, fear, pain, and therefore understood that the observer, the thinker, is part of thought. Because if there is no thinking, there is no observer, thinker. The two are inseparable. The thinker is the thought. So seeing all that, and the beauty of all that, the subtlety of all that, then where is the mind that started to inquire into this question of fear? You understand? Where now, what is the state of the mind now that has gone through all this? Is it the same as it was before it came here? Or has it seen this thing very intimately, seen the nature and the beauty of this thing called thought, fear, pleasure, seeing all that? What is the actual state of the mind now? Obviously, nobody can answer that except yourself. And if you have actually observed it, gone into it, you will see that it has become completely transformed. For most of us, freedom is an idea, but not an actuality. When we talk about freedom or think about it, we want to be free outwardly, to do what we like, to travel, free to express ourselves in different ways, free to think what we like. The outward expression of freedom seems to be extraordinarily important, especially in countries where there is tyranny, dictatorship. And in those countries where outward freedom is possible, one seeks more and more pleasure, more and more enjoyment, freedom to possess. And in the search for freedom, if one is at all serious, there is not only the outward expression of that freedom, which must, it seems to me, must come from psychological freedom, the inward freedom. And if we were to inquire deeply what that freedom implies, freedom to be inwardly, completely and totally free, which then expresses itself outwardly in society, in relationship, then we must ask, it seems to me, whether human mind, heavily conditioned as it is, can ever be free at all. Or must it always live and function within the frontiers of its own conditioning? And therefore there is no freedom at all. Or verbally understanding that there is no freedom here on this earth, inwardly or outwardly, one then begins to invent freedom in another world, liberation, moksha, heaven, and so on. So if we could put aside all theoretical, ideological concepts of freedom and actually inquire whether our minds, yours and mine, can ever be free. Freedom from dependence, psychologically, inwardly. Freedom from fear, anxiety, the innumerable problems, both conscious as well as deeper layers of consciousness. Whether there can be complete psychological freedom so that the human mind, being freed from all problems, can come upon something which is not of time, which is not put together by thought, or as an escape from the actual realities of daily existence. If we could this morning go into this question, whether the human mind, yours and mine, can ever be inwardly, psychologically, totally free. Because without that freedom, it is not possible to see what is truth, to see if there is a reality, not invented by fear, not shaped by the society, the culture in which we live, not as an escape from the daily monotony, the boredom, the loneliness, the despair, the anxiety. Because unless one is free, you can't explore, you can't investigate, you can't examine. And to look into it, there needs not only freedom, but the discipline that is necessary to observe. So freedom and discipline go together. Not that one must be disciplined in order to be free. We are using the word discipline not in the accepted accepted traditional sense, which is to conform, imitate, suppress, follow a set pattern. But rather, the root meaning of that word itself, which is to learn. So learning and freedom go together. Learning being, bringing its own discipline, not imposed by the mind in order to achieve a certain result. So those two things are necessary, essentially. The act of learning and freedom. One cannot learn about oneself unless one is free. And to learn about oneself, one must observe. Not according to any pattern, formula, or concept, but actually observe as one is. And that observation, that perception, that seeing, brings about its own discipline, its own learning, in which there is no conformity, imitation, suppression, control whatsoever. So freedom and learning are always together. And there is a great deal of beauty in that. Our minds are conditioned. That's an obvious fact. Conditioned by the culture, by the society, influenced by various impressions, strains, stresses, relationships, economic, social, climate, educational, religious conformity, sanctions, and so on. And our minds are trained to accept fear, escape if we can from that fear, never being able to resolve totally and completely the whole nature and structure of fear. So our first question is whether the mind, so heavily burdened, can resolve completely not only its conditioning, but also its fears. Because it is the fear that makes us accept conditioning. And if we may, this morning, please do not merely hear a lot of words and ideas which are really no value at all, but through the act of listening, observing your own states of mind, then we can together, both verbally and non-verbally, inquire whether the mind can ever be free from fear. Not accepting fear, not escaping from it. Not saying, one must develop courage, resistance, but actually be fully aware of the fear in which one is trapped. Because unless one is free from this quality of fear, one can't see very clearly, feel very clearly, deeply. And obviously, when there is fear, there is no love. So whether the mind can actually ever be free of fear, that seems to me one of the most primary, essential questions which must be asked and which must be resolved. For any person who is at all serious, there are physical fears and psychological fears. The physical fears of pain, having had pain and the repetition of that pain in the future. The fears of old age, death. The fears of physical insecurity. The fears of uncertainties of tomorrow. The fears of not being able to be a great success, achieve, and so on. Not being somebody in this rather ugly world. The fears of destruction. The fears of loneliness. Not being able to love or be loved, and so on. The conscious fears as well as the unconscious fears. Can the mind be free totally of all this? And if it cannot, then such a mind is incapable because it is distorted. It's incapable of perception, of understanding, of having a mind that's completely silent, quiet. Like a blind man seeking light and never finding light, and therefore inventing a light of words, concepts, theories. So how is a mind which is so heavily burdened with fear and with all its conditioning ever to be free of it? Or must we accept it as inevitable thing of life? And most of us do accept it, put up with it. So, now what shall we do? How shall I, as a human being, and you as a human being, be rid of this fear? The total fear, not a particular fear, but the whole nature and structure of fear. What is fear? Don't accept, if I may suggest, what the speaker is saying. The speaker has no authority whatsoever. He is not a teacher. He is not a guru. Because if he is a teacher, then you are the follower. And if you are the follower, you destroy yourself as well as the teacher. What we are trying to do is to find out what is truth. We're trying to go into this question of fear so completely that your mind is never afraid. Therefore, you're free of all dependence on another, inwardly, psychologically. So we are taking a journey together, not being led. Someone ahead of you and you following in his footsteps. The beauty of freedom is that you don't leave a mark. The eagle in its flight doesn't leave a mark. Only the scientist does. And in inquiring into this question of freedom, there must be not only the scientific observation, but also the flight of the eagle that doesn't leave a mark at all. Both are required, which is both the verbal explanation and the non-verbal perception, bearing in mind that the description is never the described. The explanation is never that thing which is explained. That is, the word is never the thing. So if all this is very clear, then we can proceed to find out for ourselves, not through the speaker, not through his words, not through his ideas or thoughts, to find out for ourselves whether the mind can be completely free from fear. All right, shall we go on from there? Please, this is not an introduction. If you haven't heard the first part clearly and understood it, you can't go on to the next. And to inquire, there must be freedom, as we said. To look. Freedom from prejudice, conclusions, concepts, ideals, prejudices, so that you can observe actually for yourself what is fear. And when you observe very closely, intimately, is there fear at all? That is, you can only observe very, very closely, intimately, what is fear, when the observer is the observed. And we're going to go into that. So what is fear? How does it come about? The obvious physical fears can be understood, like the dangers, physical dangers, in which there is instant response. That's fairly easy to understand, into which we need not go too much. But we're talking about psychological fears. How do these psychological fears arise? What is their origin? And whether they can end. That is the issue. What is fear? Fear of something that happened yesterday. Fear of something that might happen later on today or tomorrow. Fear of the known and fear of the unknown, which is tomorrow. The unknown being death and all the rest of it. We won't touch that, go into that question this morning.